1 month from now, we will celebrate Canada, the peace and prosperity we enjoy, and the remains of 215 Indigenous kids as young as 3 were just found in unmarked graves at a so-called school that existed to eliminate Indigenous people as Indigenous people. We as Canadians are often seen as champions of human rights around the world. Our charter has served as a model for other countries, and the remains of 215 Indigenous kids at the Kamloops residential school are also the story of thousands of children stolen from their families and sent to unmarked graves across our country. Millions of people from around the world have sought freedom in Canada, pursued safety in our multicultural society, and 215,000 of Indigenous kids are buried in unmarked graves, abused, persecuted, murdered, all sanctioned by the state. Unthinkable, but known. When I first read the news, I knew it was known, but I still couldn't process it. I wrote to my constituents at a loss for words when it comes to our shameful history. And in place of my own, I shared the words of AFN National Chief Perry Bellegarde, who wrote that while it's not new to find graves at former residential schools in Canada, it's always crushing to have that chapter's wounds exposed. Well, having found my words again with some effort, these 4 come to mind. This is our Canada. This is our Canada, and the question we face is what we will do about it. At a minimum, we need to support a full investigation on every residential school site across Canada to ensure dignity for victims and proper accountability. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission wrote that the most basic of questions about missing children, who died, why did they die, where are they buried, have never been addressed or comprehensively documented by the Canadian government. Well, our government has been working with the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation to document and previously committed almost $34 million, but it is the beginning, not the end of that process. More than that, we need a renewed and more ambitious commitment to meet the TRC's calls to action. Since 2015, we've seen considerable, albeit incomplete, action to meet those calls. It's easy to point to symbols and to say it's only words, but lifting almost 70% of long-term water advisories, legislated Indigenous languages protection with associated funding, child welfare legislation with associated funding, legislating the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and billions of federal funds invested in Indigenous communities for housing, health, and more. These are not symbols, Mr. Speaker. So my criticism is a different one. When the remains of 215 Indigenous kids are discovered in Canada, when thousands more remain undiscovered, are we doing enough? And as much as we've done, the answer is no. I am fortunate in this position, we're all fortunate in this position to meet people we would otherwise never have the opportunity to meet and to learn from people who enter our orbit who otherwise never would. And for me, I've had the opportunity to learn about intergenerational trauma from my constituent, Tanya Talaga. I've had the opportunity, because of our shared animal advocacy, to be closer to Senator Murray Sinclair, former Senator Murray Sinclair, than I otherwise would. And having engaged in conversation with Senator Sinclair about what more we can do in our last conversation on the subject before his departure from the Senate, he pointed to the government's response to the COVID crisis. And he said, look at the effort, the scale of effort that was brought to bear in response to the COVID crisis. It's incredible. It's necessary, and it's been incredible. And he said, would we have had that same scale of crisis if it was only Indigenous people affected? And I don't think the answer is yes. And I think that's a truth we have to turn our minds to, and we have to do better. I think our government has done a lot, but we have to do better. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my friend for his comments, his very thought-provoking comments. And if I can maybe just ask him to reflect a bit more on this question of how we think about Canada, how we think about Canada Day in light of these revelations, unsurprising for some, maybe new to others. In the history of many nations, there are horrific atrocities that have been undertaken, and it can be hard to think about how we relate to our country in the midst of these events. I suppose one thing that we can recognize as a country is the continuing struggles for reconciliation and how that is very much a part of the Canadian identity, that there have been horrific mistakes and that part of our identity has become to try to confront those, to apologize for them, and to move forward. And that those efforts are important. And they're still relatively unique in the world in terms of how nations respond to these kinds of events. So I wonder if the member could just reflect on how as he approaches Canada Day, what will he be thinking about in terms of what it means to be Canadian in light of these challenges and also these efforts that we're undertaking together.
Beaches, East York.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the member for the question. It won't be the first time I've turned my mind to this on Canada Day, but I will say, and I expect I will say a month from now, that I am proud of Canada and to be Canadian, but I am not proud of all of Canada, and I'm certainly not proud of all of our history. In fact, I'm ashamed of this part of our history. And the only way that we can be as proud of Canada as we ought to be going forward is to do better and to reconcile with that history. And so that's what we all need to collectively work together to do across parties, across provinces, and as Canadians.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député d'Abitibi.
The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to highlight the message for our colleague from East York, that this member is progressive and shares his convictions that are even a little avant-garde. He stated that we could do more, and I would like to know what he thinks we can do to do more with Indigenous people. What initiatives would he put forward so we can move towards this reconciliation? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For Beaches, East York.
There are many things, but I will highlight two. First, many Indigenous people no longer live on reserve. Here in Beaches, East York, I represent an urban riding, and I think we need to do much more for our urban Indigenous population. When I look at my own riding and the leadership of Task and the leadership of Lindsay Kretschmer and more, another woman who has entered my orbit, who I've been lucky to learn from, I think we need to do much more for urban Indigenous people as a matter of reconciliation. I think we need to do much more as it relates to ending poverty in the country for all people, including those who are Indigenous. The second thing I will say is in relation to child welfare. We are on the right path in this regard, and we need to heavily work with provinces because this isn't only within federal jurisdiction. But I'm very concerned that we will wake up in the future and look back and see the number of Indigenous people who've been removed from their families, and we are living through that in 2021, and we will say in the future, we are ashamed of that history. Well, we're living through that today.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Winnipeg Centre will try for a 30-second question or 30-second answer.
Yes, thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. And I'm trying to get to the truth here, and nobody's telling me the truth tonight. Is what happened in residential school genocide according to the UN Convention on Genocide, which seek to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, as such killing members of a group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of a group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within a group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another. I just want the truth this evening.
The Honourable Member
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Beaches, East York.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the member for her question and her passion on this, among other subjects. A number of different acts constitute genocide. She's listed off a number of them. Well, let me say that the intent to destroy an ethnic or racial group through forcibly transferring children of the group to another group is genocide. It constitutes genocide. And yes, I think, in my view, this was genocide.